for any who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplaces can fix our world, we got a real treat for you. I'm coming at you live from somewhere. I'm at Boston University for the Compliance Week Ethics and Compliance Summit. You got the main man, Gio Gallo, in the studio, in the King's chair. Welcome. Our benchmark report just dropped today. A lot of phenomenal insights in it, a lot of cool movements in some of these metrics. So we are going to dive right in. I, of course, am Nick Gallo, Chief Servant of Ethico. Good to see you all. Let's get a massive emoji explosion going to get going here. We got this is like the biggest day of the year for us all. So let's keep those emojis going. Keep your questions coming in the chat. We, of course, as always, are going to be the Ethico book giveaway is in live effect. And because it's benchmark day, we're giving away 10 of these babies. The benchmark should be available for download on the console. So go ahead and do that and drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. Today is a great day. If you haven't been building your network as much as you'd like, your network is your net worth, like we always say. If you haven't been building it to the extent you'd like to, today's a great day to do it. As we're going through these metrics, I want you guys to jump into the chat with your own tips. How do you look at these metrics? What other metrics do you look at the one we're talking about in conjunction with? How have you gotten these things unstuck? Share those tips with each other and connect today. I'm Nick. Like I said, this is the one and only Gio Gallo. Gio's AI here. He's got a little bit of a mix. He got a little bit of a pinch of Pedro Pascal and a pinch of who else? Maybe a little Jon Snow there?
Yeah. You know what? It does look like me. I was asking my kids and they said, yeah, that's what you look like.
All right. So with that, we're going to dive right in here. We're probably going to go a little bit long today. So if you have to leave right at the top of the hour, all good. This will be uploaded to YouTube this evening, so you can get the back half of that. And if you're interested in doing a roundtable with your group, with your team or something like that, please reach out to us because we do a lot of these smaller roundtables going through this together to really help folks strategize on how they can get some of these metrics unstuck and really build that culture of integrity where people's voices are heard and things are processing efficiently, and we can demonstrate that effectiveness. Okay, so here are the metrics we're going to talk about today. We're first going to start with issue days open. Then we're going to move to the granddaddy of them all, issue anonymity. We're going to talk about reporting channels. Where are these reports coming from? Then we're going to talk about issue categories, issue severity. How severe are these? How important? What's the mix of severity across the reporting base? We're going to talk about issue substantiation. Reporter types. We're going to talk about issue reporter awareness. Where did they find out about the Speak Up program? How did they get nudged into finally raising their hand and sharing some of that risk intelligence? We're going to talk about follow-ups. That's number 9, issue sequence, and finally average reports per 100 employees. So Gio, why don't you start kind of framing out the executive summer here? We're at this interesting inflection point in our industry. There's a lot of anxiety in our industry. And I think either way you voted, we have a new administration in place. There's a new, we're kind of stepping into this new chapter. And, the Ethico thesis is that the next 10 years can look a lot different than the last 10 years, but it's going to take us doing things differently. We are where we're at, regardless of where your numbers are relative to a benchmark or to an old company you worked at, or to a competitor. You are where you're at, which is fine. Great. Now we know where we're at. Where we're trying to go, though, we need to keep our eyes on that prize. And frankly, what got us here isn't going to get us there. So we have to do things differently, and we have to start thinking outside of the box. The name of the game over these next couple of years, as this new decade starts, is how can we better demonstrate our value to the organization? So with all of that, our job is to crowdsource this risk intelligence at scale and provide those insights back to the point of risk so that we can build this sustainable culture of integrity. But what are some of the other takeaways here, Gio, for as we get started?
Yeah, I think a big thing that's happening across our industry is, a lot of compliance and ethics leaders have known this, but also leadership is waking up to the fact that compliance and ethics can be not only certainly not the island of no, not just protectors of the company, but agents of change. And that's part of what these benchmarks are going to help you do is, realize that to the point here, there's only a fraction of the actual issues happening in your organization that you're finding out about and able to address. And we can be agents of change and moving that front forward to be figuring out how can we get people to collaborate and work with compliance more? How can compliance serve our mission and our strategy? And these benchmarks are going to help you figure out, hey, where is the place where I have the most easily accessible improvement to just, get to benchmarks. And also we're going to be giving you some tips on how to address those things where you might be off the standard. And, I think more than ever, we realize that employees care about having a voice and working for an ethical organization with a noble mission. And compliance and ethics is on the front lines of driving that impression, driving that engagement, and having those employees not just be consumers of your company culture and your mission, but contributors to it. And we can help bridge that gap, break down some of those walls that allow people to feel comfortable stepping in, speaking up, and finding out where things can be better. Ultimately, you're going to hear us keep talking about this at Ethico, that middle management is the key to a lot of these things. You can get your tone at the top. You can send out, emails and newsletters from compliance. But as you form those tighter bonds with managers around the company, help make them ambassadors, give them a proxy forum, allow them, make it easier for them to talk to employees about what matters and do the first step of interpretation, then you're going to see yourself improve against these benchmarks, blow past them, and be that shining light of culture and mission and ethics in your organization.
And this bottom bullet here is not a suggestion. This is not even a recommendation. I think that this is a mandate. We're in the first time in recorded history in a situation where managers have a lower level of engagement than the people that are reporting to them. What do you think that's going to do, right? Like, that is going to have an impact on our culture. That's a pebble in the pond. Those waves are going to ripple out in concentric circles until we do something about it. And so if we're going to change the slope of our culture of integrity, if we're going to increase the velocity of participation in the organization, we have to focus on the middle manager. And we got some great tips on that. We have a toolkit that's available as well. But this is really where the battleground is. All right, let's dive in here. Let's first start talking about case closure time. So in 2024, case closure time dropped a day down to 22 days. So this was up at about 28 days back in 2019. And we've had consistent reduction in this metric over the last several years. So this is mostly attributed to a deeper sort of concentration, or let's just say a wider adoption of some of the features that have been built into the tool. We've put a lot of work into the tool to make it a lot more efficient and build a lot more automatic workflows and a lot more automation in there, so that our thesis is that if the issue, our first thesis is that the issue intake and the case management, the enterprise-wide disclosure tool that is your Speak Up program, is really the backbone of every ethics compliance function. Like I said earlier, our job is to crowdsource that risk intelligence. We need to know where those risks are in order to start putting out those fires, which cannot be done without the participation of the workforce. And when we can be more efficient, when we can have when we can leverage technology to get these closed faster, and we can get the information to the people who need to do something about it faster so they can hit the ground running, we see a lot of great results here.
So these things should be, just real quick, Nick, this should be one of your core stats. This is this is one thing, one of the reasons why we put this up front is this is a quick, easy barometer, like taking your blood pressure of how things are going in your program. Give me a quick thumbs up if you look at your average total case closure time, at least quarterly. Hopefully it's monthly or weekly, but throw a thumbs up if this is something that you look at. And as we talk about this, these different lines here are, 2020 through 2024. And, if you look at that frequently, see where you are on the scale. As we see in the purple, companies that use the Ethico platform are closing their cases on average across this time, kind of 22 to 25 days. If you're kind of closer to that 40 in that orange, just know that there are millions of employees operating in organizations that are closing them in 25 days or less. And part of what we're going to be walking you through today are some of the ways to diagnose that, where, what might be making that longer and what you can do to drive that better. But this should give you a pretty kind of decent range of where you might target for your organization, because you can see over, what are these 5 years? These have been pretty consistent in these ranges, depending on what software platform you use and, depending on what practices are at place in your organization.
So again, I said this a little, I kind of briefly mentioned this before, but regardless of where you're at, it's kind of irrelevant. You are where you're at. This is just going to give you some insights into like what's possible. And you just have to start continuously improving, get into that continuous improvement mode, and really start setting goals and start kind of whittling this down. If nothing else, this today should be a shot in the arm. It should be a motivation for you to realize what's possible and you can start thinking about what you need to do to get there. So let's break this average down though, and let's look at the distribution of it. I'm trying to change the slides here. So the distribution of these cases, Gio, can you try to change the slide? I'm having some trouble on my console for some reason.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. Case closure time. See, you just have to be in the chair. That is the chair. That's the control center there. All right.
This is where all the power is, Nick. I mean, you brought some of it to Boston, but you left most of it in the chair.
I did. All right. So here's case closure time. We're looking now at that average distributed across 4 different buckets: 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, and over 90 days. Of course, the rule of thumb is we want to close all of our cases as fast as possible, but no faster. We're of course not trying to solve for a metric. We need to keep in mind that there's a human on the other side of it. It's somebody who is being a culture carrier. They're being a culture champion for us. And we need to, not shortchange that process, but we want to be as efficient as possible. So you can see about 80% of cases were closed in less than 30 days. And about 5% were closed in over 90 days. So the over 90-day bucket has been pretty flat. It's come down pretty significantly from 2019, which is not displayed here, but you can see in 2020 during COVID, it was closer to about 7%. So that's come down significantly. The offset in the 0 to 30 days, you can see that dropped a couple points from the trailing 5 year average. And that's been kind of pushed to that 30 to 60 day bucket. So we don't want a quarter of our reports in any of these buckets except that first one, right? We want way more than a quarter there. The driver of this is kind of 2 main things. One is there was a significant number of cases that were moved over from for people who became Ethico clients. So there is a little bit of noise in this metric. But even adjusting for that, the thing that's come up a lot over the last year is a couple of things. There's been a lot of pressure on ethics and compliance teams, budget-wise. There has been, in many cases, a reduction in workforce, and just the general turnover that has had such an uptick since the Great Resignation and this sort of new normal that we're living in has contributed to some chaos on some teams as new people come in and they don't adhere to the process in place to the extent that they need to as they're getting up their J curve and so forth. So zooming out of this, take a look at your own distribution and start to look at how does this distribution in aggregate change as I look at the distribution in the context of a particular category or in the context of a particular investigator. We can usually find clues for improvement. And again, a benchmark report is not the end of something, it's the start of something. It should give us some marching orders, so to speak. It should give us some ideas for improvement that we can start to falsify, build some hypotheses and start to falsify those by investigating a little bit further. So again, the more we can do to pull our cases into that first bucket without cutting corners, the better. So when we talk about this, what we're talking about, me and Christian Hunt had a little bit of a debate about this, and as you would expect, we ultimately were kind of saying the same thing, just saying it semantically a little bit different. But your compliance program, your ethics program, that is a process. That's a series of different processes. And your Speak Up program has a bunch of nested processes within it. And there is this theory that you learn about in MBA school called the theory of constraints. And so in any complex system that is a multi-step system, there is always one bottleneck. One of those steps is a bottleneck that ultimately governs the level of throughput or the amount of stuff flowing through that system. And that's where our efforts need to be focused. So if you, for example, your case closure time is closer to that 40 days, or you want to get it below the 30 days, the best place to start is to zoom out and look at your investigation operation as a process and see where things are kind of getting caught. There's usually, if you can take that 80-20, that Pareto approach, and we're going to be talking about Pareto approach, like always, we're going to be talking about it a lot today. When we can adopt that Pareto approach and we can break things down into their composite pieces, we can usually find ways to move the needle in a more significant way. Gio, what other case closure rate tips would you share?
Yeah, so as you go through these, you can start on your total average time. You can look at that second slide and say, how is it broken between these, these different 0 to 30 days, 30 to 60, et cetera, and then look how it's changed over time, 3 years ago, last year, and this year. And you can also start looking at categories, right? Part of how, like we were saying, this benchmark can not be the end of something in a final determination, but the start of how do you look at this more intelligently is to break this down in a few different ways. So, you can look at your investigators. You can look at what are the cases that took 30 to 60 days? Maybe I can close those in under 30 days. And you can also look at categories. So are there specific case types? Are there specific categories that if you pulled those out, or if those were at the average, your numbers would look a lot better? You should be able to kind of slice and dice those within whatever case management system you're using, or download those to Excel and pivot them or something like that. But figure out, hey, you know what? This category always takes us a while. That category probably has its own bottleneck. Maybe it gets sent to HR or legal, and you say, hey, how can I get something smoother going on here? Maybe it's an issue with, asking questions, for those categories. You usually have questions back to the reporter, and you need a way to engage that. But, what you find is that as you get a hint from the core benchmark and then you dig into it, you can find some of those sub processes that are bottlenecks and pull those out. So, a big driver of this, right? Like everything is garbage in, garbage out. Your intake methods might be a big driver of your total case closure time, right? If you typically don't get a lot of information through a certain channel from a certain location, something like that, that's going to make the rest of your investigation and your closure time harder. So figure out, hey, can you start at the front and make sure that when your team sees a report for the first time, whether it's through a proxy form, a web form, directly through a hotline, do you have a bunch of good information to go off of, or is it kind of a hint and then you have to try to find it yourself? And then, set some goals for yourself and your team. People respond to incentives, but incentives can be, cultural, and they can be sentiment based of saying, hey guys, we're really focused on this thing. Let's try to find these categories that normally take 60 days and see if we can close them in under 30 days in the next quarter, and set some of those deadlines for follow-up, for getting back to a reporter, and see how you can pull pieces out of this. Because, over and over, we see people be surprised by some of these things that we're saying. They adopt our Ethico system for intake and case management from somewhere else, and we point to a few things that we know are levers that other people have changed, in a few small tweaks end up taking 3, 5, 10 days off your average time, because there's so much stuff held up in some of those bottlenecks. And this benchmark report and doing your own analytics, using your network and talking to your peers and seeing what they do, can really, the 80-20 rule is going to say you can change a few small things and have a big impact on, again, not just your metrics, but these metrics are indicating the impact and the change that you're having on your culture.
And, I always use an analogy like this, but think about your own health, right? Like you might have certain health goals, and you might see a picture in a magazine and say, oh, I want to look like that. You are where you're at. So you might already look like that. And if you don't, if you look like me coming out of the holidays still, and you're fighting through it, your best benchmark is yourself. So Francisco made a similar point here. Thanks for sharing this, Francisco. It's one thing to extrapolate from benchmark reports and other aggregation documents, but a totally different experience by going to primary source documentation. Very eye-opening. I can't agree with that more. Of course, triangulate across your competitors, across what's going on in these benchmark reports, but your best benchmark is yourself. Where were you at a year ago? Where were you at 2 years ago? And what has caused changes right now? If you can't articulate those things, there might be an opportunity to find some different levers to pull to increase the effectiveness of your program. So we talked a little bit about leveraging investigation technology. There's probably features in your tool, whether you're with us or you're with somebody else, that you're not utilizing, that can probably increase the throughput and increase the efficiency of your program. So reach out to your client success person or your account management person and just make sure, get a little retrain on your tool, and make sure that you know what the new features are that are available, and that you have an understanding on how those might integrate. So your big takeaway for case closure time is to recognize that there are bottlenecks in your process for sure. And to the extent you can put attention on those bottlenecks, and you can break down the steps that are within that particular component of your process, that'll do a lot to free up some more resources at the end of the day. When we are at the stage that we're at, where our value is questioned, where there's this sort of macro trend of being able to show our value, right? Like that's happening across organizations. It's happening across the country. It is imperative that we are figuring out ways to intersect with the business and add value to the business. It's imperative that we can figure out ways to see around the curve, because the odds of us in the next year getting all these resources we've been asking for the last couple of years is probably a lot lower, right? Like if we're moving into a recession and companies are tightening their belts, then you're probably not going to get the purse strings loosened to the extent that you want. So then what are you going to do? Well, it's on you, right? Like we have high agency, we have a unique skill set, we have technology, we have tools. It's on us to solve for our outcome. And when we can build efficiency into our operation, we can often find, found headcounts, so to speak, to get those gains that, we were kind of begging for. All right, let's jump to issue anonymity. This is the granddaddy metric, in my opinion. This is because this is such a great barometer for broad corporate trust. So last year we saw the identified rate. This has climbed pretty significantly. It used to be back in kind of like 2/3, and now it's almost to 3/4. So we jumped another percentage point last year, and that's compared to the historical or the status quo average, which is a little bit closer to kind of the mid-50s area. Gio, when you think about issue anonymity, what do you think the big driver is for this increase in identified rate? Beyond the retrain that we did a couple of years ago, where we said, okay, we're not going to, we're going to have unbounded conversations. We're going to have human-centric, empathetic elicitation. If this conversation goes 15 or 17 minutes, fine. Let's shift our focus to giving good information, a great caller experience and good information for the investigators. What are some other elements you think go into a relatively higher identified rate?
Yeah. So, it starts with that intake. Is it easy? Can people find it? Do they, especially if it's something they're really nervous about and they want to call anonymously to the hotline, how does that intake happen? But the big thing that is continuing to drive this forward, when we started measuring this 6 years ago and, we noticed that 2/3 of people were identifying themselves, that was already a big step up above the industry average in orange. But I think we've continued to see that progress because of things that happen after intake. And by that, I mean the ways that you engage with your team, with, people who report end up circling around the organization. People end up, identifying themselves during the process and saying, hey, you know what? I got a message back from the compliance team quickly. It seems like they care about this. I'm going to go ahead and talk to them. The way that you do your follow-up, from how quickly, you ask your first question to how respectful and clear and professional you are in the process to doing things like implementing corrective action plans at the end that include a reminder to check and make sure that there's not retaliation. All those things you do after that initial touch, even if you see an initial kind of report and investigation as a line from start to close, right? When you zoom in, it looks like one, but when you look at your whole company and your whole culture, this is an ongoing cycle. This is an ecology, an ecosystem of someone reported, they've told people what it's about, they encourage them. If you can be driving that in a good line, then more and more people are going to come in and say, hey, you know what? I'm not the only person I've ever heard of engaging this program. I know several people who reported something and they said that it went well and they're glad they did. So I'm going to do it as well. And, that's not going to happen with every person, but this is such an important barometer, this anonymity rate or the inverse of it, the identified rate, because as people are more comfortable to identify themselves, that's an indication that on average, more employees are trusting your program. They see compliance as somebody that is pushing forward the ethical culture and mission that they care about. And you can push that forward like I've been talking about, not just on, what the web form looks like or how that intake method is. That's like the clearest, biggest first impact. But all of your follow-up, being the ways that you engage and follow up professionally can drive this forward over time because it's an ecosystem.
And when we move to the unbounded, conversations, at least on the hotline intake, that's the piece that we cover for our clients. We started 2 years ago. Last year, the trailing 2 years, about 50% of the people who came into the reporting process that wanted to remain anonymous ended up converting to identified by the back end of that call. That jumped 5 more points last year. So all of this is really kind of coming together because it's that if we need the engagement of the workforce to do our job, then that process, that interaction with the ethics and compliance department needs to be as good as possible. We want to have a high client satisfaction, so to speak, a high stakeholder satisfaction. Last year, we started measuring this. We put a new process in place where people could rate their experience at the end of the call. And 92% of people in the last 12 months said 5 star. So 5 out of 5 stars, 92%. So again, this stuff is achievable. but we have to do things a little bit different. So if our folks need to spend a little bit more time on the call, or they need to be a little bit more flexible, or if your managers need to be a little bit more flexible when they're taking a proxy report so that person can feel heard, that is a little bit of education that can have a massive impact, because anybody who has a crappy experience with intake, they're of course telling their friends, they're telling their friends at lunch, they're telling their friends at the water cooler. And we need to take a card out of the marketing playbook, or out of the client success or client service playbook, and recognize that we need to serve these people well, and we need to give them a great experience. This can have a really strong effect, and you can see this across some of these different industries. We've seen a big push in technology, sort of on a macro level, over the last several years, of a push for transparency. Gio, can you change the slides? I don't know what's going on here for me.
Yes, I can. I can try.
Will you change the slides? Will you change the slides? Is the question. Okay, thank you.
This is giving you some sense of how these things look different across your industry. With this huge data set that we have, we have a huge sample set, a huge population. There are ways to cut this a bunch of different ways. What this is part of how you keep this relevant for your organization, is say, hey, you know what? Last year I just looked at it generally. Now I'm going to dig in for my industry, or I'm going to dig in by category, or I'm going to dig in by channel. And you should continue to progress your skill and your ability as a leader to dig deeper into this. And this is, just one example of doing this by industry. So try to pay attention to that. And the better you can approximate what you're benchmarking against to your actual company, your company size, industry, things like that, the better insights you're going to be able to get, so that you're not trying to achieve something that most people don't in your industry.
Valen said something really smart here. Love this, Valen. 1,000 points for you. She asked the question, what is an effective way of measuring retaliation? Retaliation can be subjective. So this is an important point I want to just sit on for a quick sec. Yeah, it might be retaliation is in the eye of the beholder. So if you think you're getting retaliated against, the effect is the same as if they're actually getting retaliated against. ECI's report from a couple of years ago said that over 50% of people who spoke up faced actual retribution. So even if your organization is twice as good as the average organization, that's still 1 in 4 people are perceiving that they're experiencing retribution, retaliation, whatever you want to call it. So I think the safest thing to do is to assume that it's a problem. Look, all of this is about trust, right? People need to trust the process. If they trust the process, the identified rate goes up. If they can get their questions answered, their identified rate goes up. If they don't feel like they need to lean into the self-preservation that we're all wired with, because they think they're going to, get fired or lose their paycheck, well, then your identified rate is going to go up. So I think if trust is the main thing, and there's an elephant in the room, and we are just blind to it, the elephant being the retaliation problem, and we're blind to it, and we're just kind of ignoring it, and we say we have a zero policy, or zero tolerance policy for retaliation. Well, that's a trust killer. I think the safest thing is to assume that there's probably retaliation going on. There's at least perceived retaliation going on, and a little campaign over 2 quarters to address it. And building into your process, this is the best way to measure it in my mind. We have to create the circumstances for success. We need to be able to create data pools ourselves, fast metrics that can confirm that the efforts we're putting forth are actually moving the needle in the right way. So just putting something in place to say, after I close a report, any identified reporter, I'm going to follow up 30 days later or 60 days later and check in on them and see if they've experienced any retaliation. That can do a ton to very quickly address the potential retaliation issue in the organization. It is subjective, but I'm just saying, don't let the subjective nature of it cause you to undersample the importance of getting it right, because that perception is the reality for the workforce, and the vibe and the word of mouth ends up affecting the behaviors which we need to engage with in order to do our job. Okay, let's dive into this thing. I love that question. Keep these questions coming. We're up to almost 2,500 emojis. We're only not even a half hour in. This is phenomenal. Okay, so we just talked about issue anonymity. Earlier this week, I did a session with Philippe Maldonado of Salesforce talking about measuring cultural health. And a big portion of that conversation, this was for SCCE, a big portion of that conversation was diving into our speak up data and sharing strategies on how to get a better read on how healthy things are. So in most cases, we tend to, in this industry, we tend to look at metrics in a siloed nature. But Francisco kind of alluded to this. We need to start looking at metrics in conjunction with other metrics. So what this slide is showing is issue anonymity cut against reporting channel. So there's three main channels, right? We have web form, we have hotlines, and we have proxy reports, or where someone goes in office to report to a manager directly or report to somebody on the compliance team directly. So when we look at these three metrics across our issue anonymity and we measure case closure time, it tells some very interesting stories. So ideally, we want to be totally agnostic about an identified report and a anonymous report. We want to be agnostic because, hey, we know that there's tons of risk intelligence in our organization, and we know that we're only getting a piece of it. So we want to get as much of that as we can. We want to leverage technology to direct our eyes and our efforts toward the fires that matter most, and use technology again to the extent possible to close the things that don't matter or that are relatively lower severity faster. But what you can see here is that there is a significant difference across these channels relative to anonymous rate. So you can see that things that were submitted by the hotline have the lowest anonymous rate across either channel. Or I'm sorry, yeah, they have, whether identified or anonymous, things through the hotline have a faster case closure time. So that might be an indication of better information being gathered on that intake channel. You can see that in office, identified is kind of right in line with that. But anonymous in office is significantly higher. It's almost 2 work weeks higher. And then let's look at online. Online kind of has different movements there, right? So its identified rate is 22 days, a little bit higher than in office and hotline. But the anonymous online rate is 2 days lower than the in-person in office. So again, if you did this quick cut of your own data, you would probably see some differences like this. If we're just looking at case closure time in aggregate, not bounced against anything else, we might arrive at a different conclusion. So this is a very easy pivot table to make. This is a very easy report to have saved inside of your system. But again, if you have a significant difference of 2 weeks or twice as long almost, I mean, look at that. Look at the 16 days versus the 28 days. Those are the same reports that one took twice as long to close. So what is going on that in-person submission? Are those folks, are those managers equipped to get the right information? When they're anonymous, do they have the wherewithal and do they have the checklist, so to speak, to ask those additional questions to make it easy for the investigator who ultimately gets that report to hit the ground running? So I think this is a great illustration of the importance of looking at your data or like looking at different data points together, because all of this is just an effort of continuous improvement, right? This is all meant to give us a guide on where we need to direct our efforts to drive more effectiveness and drive more efficiency. Again, you can see on the right-hand side, there's kind of an interesting story that, you know, it's what you would expect. So like issue anonymity tends to correlate with cases that have, you know, that are more in line with like self-preservation type things. So as you'd imagine, about half of the HR cases, you can see 45%. Half of the discrimination cases, about 40% of theft and fraud and stuff like that, 40% of compliance issues. All of those are kind of higher acuity issue types, I guess, category types, and those have a relatively higher anonymous rate. And then you have stuff on the other end of the spectrum like privacy or business quality that have a relatively lower anonymous rate. So again, bouncing your anonymous rate up against categories can also give you some hints as to where something might need to get unstuck, where you might need to give a different directive to middle management or to your hotline folks so that they can ask those right questions and make it easy. Like, we need to make ethics easy for ourselves. We need to put the circumstances for success into place for ourselves. And we need to remember that we are the architects of our destiny. Whatever outcomes we're getting, we are playing a role in that system. And if we don't like, if we don't like what's for dinner, then we need to make something else for dinner. Let's kind of carry forward this concept of looking at metrics in looking at two different metrics together. Because if you just look at one of them, it can lead you to a much different story. So Gio, walk us through this matrix and kind of describe to us how this thing works and why we need to keep our eye on multiple balls at the same time.
Yeah. So as you get more and more familiar with analyzing your data, benchmarking, if you've been with us for a few years on our annual benchmark report, you'll realize that you can't always conclude a lot from just looking at one metric, right? You can't just go to the doctor, they don't just, have you step on the scale. They also check your blood pressure. They might also, measure your muscle mass or something like that. Those things together can form a richer picture. So what this framework is showing is that you want to compare, your percentage anonymity rate to your, how many reports per 100 you're getting or how frequent people are reporting. Where you don't want to be is in this bottom left corner where very few people report and most of them are anonymous, right? So, both of those things are both kind of pointing down, and you're saying, you can basically conclude that like you're kind of only getting anonymous reports. And there's another organization that might be your same size, your same industry, things like that. And they've built a different program, a different culture, a different level of engagement. And, there's another 1, 2, 3 people per 100 that are reporting because they're comfortable reporting and being identified. And you're kind of only getting people to step in and say, okay, well, I really have to say something about this, but I really want to kind of stay out of it. So you want to try to, if you're kind of in, call it maybe these bottom left for one of those 4 boxes, you want to try to map your path to get up to the top right? So you want to be in a place where you have a lot of reports, right? You're hearing about a lot of stuff, right? We should never expect that we hear about every bad thing that happens in our organization, but you want to push that number up, and you want to have a relatively high incidence of people identifying themselves. That's not only going to help you close your cases faster because you can talk with them and interact more, but it's also an indication that you have a higher level of trust because there's so much psychology embedded in this anonymity rate. This is one of the densest representations of the kind of psychological stance of your workforce. So generally, one way that we think about it is if you can do an initiative to push up or to the right on here from closer to the bottom left, you probably want to get more people reporting and push how well your anonymous reports are working and how safe it is and things like that, because that marginal person who might not step in, they're probably going to step in as an anonymous reporter first, and then you can get that cycle going, those stories, those anecdotes of somebody saying, hey, you know what, I spoke up and, my manager didn't come after me. It seems like it got solved and things like that. And then you can kind of move up here to get, more reports and still a high anonymity rate, and then try to move to the right. And as more people have reported and experienced kind of, a safe result after an anonymous report, then try to, tell people, hey, you know what, we will also take care of you and, do what we can to prevent retaliation, even if you identify yourself. So that's just one way that you can think of playing off these 2 different metrics to identify where you are. And then again, there's always a next step here, right? A benchmark is not a destination. It's a starting point to help you map your journey. And, wherever you are on here, you can say, okay, well, I want to go up and to the right, but should I go up first and then right and something like that? So let's get into some tips here. The reason we're going so deep on anonymity is because it is such a bellwether for your culture, for the sentiment and the psychology of your employees as they interact with your Speak Up program. So you want to try to figure out how can you infer something from your anonymity rate, maybe get some anecdotes. You don't only need hard, statistically significant data to take a step forward in your program. You just need some indications to say, hey, how might I be able to do this differently? So one way that you might do that is if you see a low number of overall reported issues and a high anonymity rate, if you're in that bottom left, then, those hesitant employees might need to hear some stories, might need to hear, hey, you know what? We got 15 reports over the past month and, 12 of those have already been closed out and we've done something about them. How can you blind that information, share a story that, has been anonymized or something like that of how they've led to positive changes? Communication is culture and culture is compliance. If you want to drive your culture of compliance forward, you have to communicate. And if you feel like you're stuck, you have to consider communicating in new ways. In sharing those stories, putting a proverbial face to a name. You don't have to actually put somebody's like employee profile picture on it, but making kind of a visceral story that says, hey, this is something that actually happened in our organization. We're not afraid to admit that things go wrong. We're going to show you what we've done about it. Telling those stories, we're all social beings, that can help change this psychology that is so central to this anonymity issue for you and your organization.
I love that thing you said. Communication is culture, is compliance. I mean, that was great. That's a t-shirt right there. I love it. But, think about your anonymity rate. Like, to the extent you have a goal around an anonymity rate, I think we don't take advantage of the human nature of our business enough. Like we should be sharing, and we should be saying, hey, our anonymous rate was 50% last year. That's an indication to us that there's a problem and there's a trust issue in our organization. So we're going to be attacking that head on this year. We want to stamp out retaliation. We want to make sure you guys know that this is a company that you can trust and that your voice is going to be heard. And we're going to try to drive that down. It's not your rate. It's your company's rate. It's everyone's rate. It's the collective use rate. So bring them into the process because their participation is critical for you to like move the metric. That's just a very strong, it's a very strong move to share that and to share that goal and share that mandate that you have for yourself because you have a workforce full of people that want this. They want to work in a workplace that values them, that is serious about their about their values and so forth. You just have to convince them of it. So let's talk about some more anonymity tips. So it's all about gathering the right details. When investigators can hit the ground running, they can close those cases faster. And when people understand the process, they understand what information they need to give, and they understand the protections that you have spent money and you've spent time and you spent resources to put in place on their behalf, we can start to get that rate down a little bit. Anonymous communication back and forth is really critical. Whether someone is identified or anonymous, they're still a human being. They still have those that desire to get those loops closed and get those answers, receive those answers. So your tool should have a way to communicate with anonymous reporters, even if it's just thanking them, even if it's just telling them when the thing is closed, even if it's just following up with them, like I said, 30 or 60 days afterwards to make sure that there was no retaliation in place. All these things stack together to really start to change the direction and change the slope of the curve of your culture of integrity. So the final key here, we have to foster the speak up culture. This is not sort of trite at this point, in my mind, at least. We're always talking about it, but there's always risks going on. And, we're in the knowledge work economy where people are their work. The level of engagement we get with our compliance program is directly correlated with the level of true sort of sustainable cultural integrity within our organization. So figure out ways with your unique business, with the idiosyncratic risks that you are, managing, figure out ways to build that trust and hit that head on. Because if we're sitting back and we're just crossing our fingers and we're hoping that, the stakeholders are looking at the posters and reading the newsletters and doing that calculus and being like, wow, these people really care. I think that's a much slower way to get these metrics moved. So bring them into the process. All right.
Yeah, one final thing here before we move on. I really want to get to these channels, but make sure for anonymity and for the concern over retaliation, which is such a driver of people not reporting at all or reporting anonymously, that you leverage your strengths. I think there's a great chance that you and your team know what best practices are, have put some things in place, policies and procedures to make sure that, information doesn't leak and things are anonymized properly and things like that. Before you completely revamp your culture or, your process, try communicating that process and saying, hey, this is how we define retaliation. Here are the things that we have in place for it. Here's what we check on. Just communicating that to people, think about all the things that you've learned and put in place that the average rank and file employee doesn't realize. So they're considering reporting with just whatever's in their mind about they read something online and they saw something on Twitter, or you can call it X if you want, about someone getting retaliated against. That's what they think happens in corporate America or corporations or big cold companies, and just communicate, hey, you know what? We're on top of this. We've been doing this for years and years, and here are all the things that we're already doing to protect you. And just by talking about it and naming that elephant in the room, that retaliation is something that they have a reasonable concern about, and you're working hard to prevent it, can get people to say, okay, maybe I'll take a shot on it and, and jump in. Leverage your strengths, communicate what you're already doing, because I guarantee you, there's probably no employee outside your compliance department that is thinking about your speak up culture as much as you are. So you got to put it in front of them and tell them all the great things that you're doing. Give yourself some credit. Do a little humble brag, pat yourself on the back, and let them know how hard you're working to protect them and to build that ethical culture.
Let's dive into reporting channel. There's a lot of great information here. So In 2024, the aggregate reporting rate was 3.5 reports per 100 compared to 1.6 in the status quo. The status quo throughout this presentation is the NavX report, which turns out they're dropping today. So we will update the report with those numbers as soon as we get our hands on them. But I want to dive into this a little bit more because, you know, a benchmark, like we were saying earlier, it's just something to start to shoot for. So if you're kind of at the status quo level, well, then maybe you want to set a goal for, you know, what we're showing in the benchmark report. If you're already well beyond that, you need to set a goal on something else. But setting a goal on something else isn't, you know, to the extent you want to set a goal on something else, it's important to kind of recognize like what the natural limit of that something else is. So what am I saying? I'm saying how many freaking reports are in your organization? We're talking about 3.5 reports or 1.6 reports per 100, yet we know people are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to their middle managers to report something before they use these sort of, you know, more established channels. So when you cut that against what we're seeing here, you know, in the Ethico bar, we're only seeing 1 report per manager per 100, right? So obviously that's, you know, almost twice what the status quo is. That's great. We put out this great manager, not my words, everyone's just telling me about it. We put out this great manager toolkit, a great free resource to start engaging that. And we've seen some decent movement, but I'm saying that there's orders of magnitude, more reports, more risk intelligence in the organization. And I think when we can wrap our head around that and we can try to make it easy to bring these people into the process, these people being the middle managers, the true culture carriers across our organization. I read an interesting stat this week that said 1 disengaged manager can cause 7 to 12 disengaged employees. So the battleground is there. We got to get these guys engaged and we have to make it easy for them to be those culture carriers, because as that engagement drops, the extent to which they sing that song with their full chest, the song of integrity that you know, you're passing song sheets around for, that starts to go down. So let's double click in this. There's 3 main channels. We have Hotline, we have web, and we have middle manager. Again, we're going to be talking about middle manager for the next year, at least until this channel really blows up and really starts creating a point of leverage for ethics and compliance departments. So let's start with the bottom one, the hotline. You know, there's a lot of chatter in our space about no one uses the hotline anymore and blah, blah, blah. It is what it is. We need to be able to have, you know, a bunch of nets out in the water so that we can catch the fish. And ideally, we want to be agnostic across these channels. But I think it's important to note that the hotline reporting rate is beyond, by itself, that channel by itself is beyond the status quo, all the status quo channels. So it's still a significant channel that we have to get right. And you could see on a couple slides ago that reports coming through there seem to be of higher quality. There seems to be better information. There seems to be a statistically significantly lower you know, anonymous rate. And the case closure time is up to, I think it was like about twice as fast as anonymous online reports. Okay, so this is still an important channel to get right. And again, we'll talk about some tips here in a second. Let's jump to the top of the stack. The top of the stack, we've seen like significant increase in that. It's kind of doubled since 2019. So we need to be really smart about meeting people where they're at. That's a nice little catchphrase in our space. We want to meet people where they're at, and we want to make it easy for them to report, and we want to make it easy for our investigators to hit the ground running. So that's a hard thing to balance, right? Like that's a difficult set of trade-offs to like get right in a sustainable way. So that requires constant improvement. It requires a feedback loop of going back and checking your intake process, making sure that it's still dialed in for your particular business, making sure that you're refreshing your directives and the questions that you're asking, making sure that your branching logic or your dynamic questions according to different categories on your web form are also capturing the right information. When we have a fish on the line, we don't want that fish swimming away. So we want to be smart about how these things are constructed. So we expect this web form channel. We expect that to you know, probably increase over time, but I don't ever imagine that we'll ever be at a place where 90% of our reports are through the web. I mean, Amazon, I've talked about this in the past. You know, there was a time where you couldn't talk to anybody at Amazon. You had to dig into the freaking bowels of the site map to figure out a number to call. Now you can get on the phone with an Amazon rep, you know, within 2 minutes. So there's just some things that people want to, you know, talk to another human being about. So we just have to get all these things right. And I think we'd be remiss to not put the right attention on that hotline piece, because it's, it's approximately half of the intake. And there's such an opportunity to really juice that experience and make that caller experience significantly better.
Yeah, let me just comment on that, right? Each of you are at a place in your organization where you have your own logical next step. And I think there's a lot of temptation or risk to say, hey, maybe doing something completely new is what is going to change my destiny for my organization. And we're fully supportive of that. We have multiple forms for web intake. We have proxy forms. We have text intake. We have, a chat bot for people to do chat, because that's a more and more common way for people to communicate. But what we're seeing across a bunch of these benchmarks is the core blocking and tackling of people calling a hotline when they're especially concerned or nervous to interact with somebody, people interacting with their manager directly, reporting in office, and or doing that through a proxy form where they're in office and then their manager fills out a form. Those are still great, powerful ways to make an impact on your organization. So, listen, we're a software company. We're technology forward. We offer all of that stuff, and we're happy to help people adopt those things and start making them available. But the things that have been core to your organization are still where a bunch of reports are coming in, where you can, have your specific culture impacting how that intake happens, and how people are interacted with. And make sure you're balancing, making sure the core things that have always been part of your program are materially better, and adding some of these new things as a pilot, or seeing if that gets you to a new spot. But sticking to that core, making sure your fundamentals are solid. We still have a lot of headroom to get better on those things.
So here's the reporting channel rate across different business sizes. So you can, bounce your own numbers up against these. And again, there's no right answer here. There's no formula. We're not making a beef Wellington. There's no recipe for this. It's going to be a function of your particular business, the place that you're at, the maturity of your program, the risks of your industry, the age, the composition of your workforce. All those idiosyncratic characteristics are what you need to account for first. And it's all just about setting an achievable goal and working toward that goal, and setting another goal and working toward that goal, and over and over and over again. Let's jump down to some more reporting channel tips here. So when you're thinking about your reporting channels, how do your reporting channels work? Is one wildly higher than others? Why is that happening? Is that the right mix for your organization, or are there opportunities and some of these, less utilized channels to get more throughput and get more risk intelligence? How long after a new employee starts, do they actually understand what's needed in the reporting process? How long after employees are updated on new reporting options? If you've made something new available, what percentage of the employee base understands that exists and knows what you need from it? These are some great questions to ask, again, in conjunction with your initial sort of cursory analysis of how your reporting channels are working right now. And do you see, again, go back to case closure time, this is a great way to find opportunities for improvement. Do you see significant differences, significant outliers in case closure times across different channels? If you do, there's high likelihood that the right information is not being gathered, or if there's a relatively higher anonymous rate across some of these channels, there's probably an opportunity for some additional education. So that can be in the form of a campaign. It can be in a TikTok style video. You can use AI to make a UGC video, a user generated content video of an avatar talking about the program or something. There's 1,000 ways to solve these problems, but the way that's best to solve it is going to be a function of your particular business. So I'm just saying, get out of the passenger seat, grab onto that steering wheel, and drive your program in the direction that is best. So let's jump into some tips here, G.
So, this proxy reporting through middle managers is just such a powerful tool. We've seen people implement that, and they see within 1 to 3 months that start driving materially different engagement, and that's sustained. If you check out in our middle manager toolkit, in our white paper, we talk about how compelling this can be, not to recruit a manager to serve the needs of compliance, but allow yourself as the compliance and ethics team to support the goals of that middle manager. And by that, I mean, when employees view their manager as someone who is ethical, who they look up to, they're 5 times more likely to stay with them, to not turn over, to respect them, and to follow their guidance.
Exactly.
And what you can do is, don't present this as, hey, you better be filling out a proxy form when someone asks you this question, but saying, hey, if you present yourself as an ethical leader, your employees are going to follow you better. And also, you don't have to become a compliance officer on your own. Let us help you, support you, be part of this, fill out the proxy form, and you can interact with the employee, and then we'll handle kind of the nitty-gritty of the investigation. But make sure that you present this in a way, right? This is how you get adoption, right? The carrot and the stick. Offer them a carrot coated in honey, dipped in powdered sugar, that they're going to really love to do, and say, hey, I'm here to help you be a more successful manager. Here's how I, as an ethics leader, can help you do that. That proxy thing has so much leverage in it. And it's not just posting up a form. You need a little bit of enablement to help them figure out how to conceive of that differently, because the odds are that manager in their last role at their last company was not getting that type of guidance with someone who, comes to the Ethicsverse and learns all of these tips. Give them a little bit of enablement, find who you can, bring into kind of that proxy middle manager thing early, and start building that as part of your culture. But realize that you're not just demanding something of managers, you're offering something that's going to help them. And building those bonds and that support across different departments is how great compliance programs are built. So another one, you want to jump to abandonment rate? We got to kind of get moving here.
Let's do one more here. Look, I know. Look, we have another half hour we're going to go through here. I don't want to blow through this stuff, because I think, we've kind of brought to the front of the presentation what I think are like some of the most important metrics. So feel free, like I said, to stick around, or you can watch the replay on YouTube a little bit later. Let's talk about one more here. I really think that the second one is important, creating channel-specific training for intake specialists. So everybody is a potential intake specialist within your organization. Everybody has the opportunity to speak up on behalf of somebody else in the organization. And so, again, starting with some data and looking at where you're at relative to a benchmark, or where you used to be or where you want to be, can give you some tips on where there might be some channel-specific training. So giving, again, download that manager toolkit. Maybe someone can drop the manager toolkit in here. We have a great thing you can download. It's just a little cheat sheet for managers. You can edit it yourself, add your logo, add your links and numbers and stuff like that. But giving some brief training of 10, 15-minute training to those middle managers is going to do a lot to increase the level of quality from that particular channel. So again, all this stuff is movable. All of this stuff is effectable. We just have to put some effort into it and put some intentionality behind it. Let's talk about abandonment rate, because nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. So listen, check out your emoji bar. And if you've done a test call to your hotline and or done a test report into your web form over the past year, give yourself a heart, because you're doing one of the things that is going to keep you closest to understanding the experience of your core customer, that reporter. But this abandonment rate is around that kind of concept of doing a test call. You should understand what that experience is like for, there we go, we got those hearts rolling in. Good job, guys. The abandonment rate is basically like an abandoned cart, right? In e-commerce, if somebody puts some products in their cart and they say, I'll come back to it later, and they didn't purchase, they leave that there, and Shopify is going to tell you you're leaving billions of dollars on the table, or whatever it is. This abandonment rate is that same thing. Somebody has gotten so close to the front door, almost knocked on the front door, metaphorically speaking, of the compliance program, and then they hang up the phone. Why does that happen? Because they aren't treated right. They're treated like a robot. They're treated impersonally. They're left waiting on the call for 3, 5, 10 minutes. And what employees end up telling themselves and saying is, hey, you know what? These guys, right? These guys have told me all of this stuff about how it's important to speak up, and I should be brave, and it matters for the company. And then I call in, I got a 15-minute break, and I'm spending 12 minutes on it waiting for somebody to answer the phone. Those types of things that are happening on your intake channel, especially on the hotline, can be real killers. Not only did you miss that report, but that person is probably, next time someone asks them, or just when they're commiserating over lunch, going to say, hey, you know what? that compliance team is kind of full of it because I called in and no one even wanted to take my call, so they can figure it out on their own. That's what you want to avoid. And you want to understand what is the abandonment rate of whatever vendor you're using to run your hotline. Hopefully, we're all at a place where, a third-party anonymized hotline is where the phone calls go, not, to the desk of the CEO's admin on a voicemail. But not every call center is the same. I'm sure you've had some experiences with a call center of, as a consumer-centric organization that has well-trained people and they answer quickly and stuff like that. And then you've called whatever, the cable company or whatever that is. If people are calling up, they've gotten so close to submitting a report and then they hang up because they were waiting too long, then that's part of why you might be in that orange range on your benchmark of the number of reports that you're getting. So ask, whoever you're using for their stats about abandonment rate. There's a lot that we've done over the past 10 or 20 years at Ethico to make sure that we do a bunch of things in our process to make sure that doesn't happen. We're here less than one report missed per 100, and industry standard status quo is 8, 12, 15% of the times that people call, they end up hanging up. And those are likely golden reports, important information that you're not going to hear about until maybe too late.
It's an important thing to get right, I mean, again, we're talking about building trust. We make all these claims and you see the smiling person on the speak up poster, and then they're sitting there listening to freaking Careless Whisper music. Nobody likes that. Okay. Careless Whisper is out. All right, let's jump to categories. Okay, issue categories. So we do a lot to normalize categories across all of our clients. Everybody has a different sort of category set. So we're going to be talking about some things in aggregate, but before we get into it, again, I just want to reiterate that the most important category benchmark for your company is your company. So how have your categories changed, and can you explain those changes anecdotally or from a data-driven perspective? How can you have confidence that you have a handle on how things are moving and how the workforce is interacting on different sort of topic types? One other point, well, I'll share this in the tips. So HR has remained stable at about 25%. We saw some jumps and some drops though. So the biggest jumps we saw last year were in the compliance, regulatory, COI, and legal category. That jumped almost 2 points up to over 10%. Last year, it was, I think, a little bit under 10% if I'm doing the quick math here. I just did that in my head. How do you like that? So when we see changes in administrations, when we see economic uncertainty, when we see tightening of the belt and more fear, that coincides typically with more fraud, waste, abuse, more violation type of things. And so that is kind of, that makes sense. I would expect that to continue if, in fact, we are stepping into a bit of a tougher economic environment. And then where do we see a drop? Well, we saw a drop of 1% and we saw a drop of 2%, both in privacy and business quality, respectively. So again, if you look within your own categories and you see movements of over 1%, and these are relatively stable over time within your business, I would want to diagnose those and make sure I understand what's going on. Like when the Me Too movement happened, we saw a lot more discrimination, harassment, and retaliation stuff. When COVID happened, we saw a bunch more safety type of reports. In the next year, when there were all those famous privacy things where, freaking credit cards and like social security numbers were being leaked, we saw a massive spike in privacy concerns. So whatever's going on in the country, whatever's going on in the headlines seems to correlate with shifts in categories within our organization. But if we can step out of that, and remember what our job is not to be a bumper sticker on the car, and our job is not to even be a seatbelt. Our job is to be the headlights on the car of commerce, the vehicle that is our business, so that vehicle can drive down the road faster and see around those curves when it's hard to see. If that's our job, we need to help our organization see around the curves to say, okay, well, last time we were in a recession, what did we see? What big compliance risks happened? What big discrimination, harassment, whatever? What did we see last time? And or what are we likely going to see given the current risk landscape? If we can start to form hypotheses about what's going to happen in the future and be monitoring those hypotheses to falsify it, well, then the odds of us, driving in the rearview mirror, so to speak, just managing by lagging indicators that in many cases are very stale by the time we get them, is going to be diminished significantly, and we can show up in a lot more meaningful way to the organization. So we're going to break down these categories with this really cool infographic. One more round of applause for Selena, our in-house artiste. She really just has upped everything. All the visuals for Ethico are up thanks to Selena. But I really love this infographic because it really boils down what we've seen on the category perspective for the last year. And again, you can see how we've cut this across like employees, for example. So in aggregate, 25% were human resource reports. But out of all the issues, what are employees mostly reporting? Employees are 40.5%. Talking about human resources, while customers, as you'd imagine, are talking about business quality. We're going to be talking in a moment about opening up our channels to more stakeholders because our job is risk intelligence, and we want to know where there's a fire sooner or sooner rather than later. Gio, do any more of these jump out at you?
I want to dig in on HR, and then I'll bring up another one. But this has been pretty stable, the incidence of HR issues across the time that we've been doing this benchmark report. And it just continues to be double underlined for me as we interact with clients, how important that integration is across the compliance and HR teams. So, some of you might see that as maybe an annoyance and they're resistant and they don't have the same focus of you. High performing organizations build strong bonds, both interpersonally and through systems between these two different departments. And we've seen, an increasing number of HR teams asking for, that collaboration through an API, or even, for enterprise companies, we've been doing a demo of our case management system to the compliance team. Someone who comes along from HR and they say, hey, this is better than our case management system. Let us have our own instance within the MySim Ethico case management system. And that collaboration drives these metrics forward. If you can, properly route those things, have access and see when something needs to be shared, share something back and forth, split an investigation, those kind of things. These are people issues, right? We're in the business of people as much as our policies and our procedures and our systems are important for us as leaders. This is all about people because culture and ethics ultimately are about impacting people's lives. And part of what comes with that people issue is not just HR, but the messiness that this issue might be a policy violation and also something about, management interactions that HR needs to do something with that is not really critical or like core to the ethics function. Getting those things, getting your HR team access to your system, being able to share data and reports, being able to share cases and investigations is increasingly a driver of people kind of moving into the next tier, the next decile of performance as an ethical organization. And it's easier now than ever to make sure that is relatively automated and collaborative instead of just a headache. So consider how you can build those interpersonal bonds and tie your systems together.
And I think people are recognizing that this holistic approach to interacting with the stakeholders is super critical. Like if you go to a restaurant, you've heard all these great things about the restaurant and you have a bad dining experience because the kitchen messed something up. You might not be mad at that server, but you're probably not going to go back to that restaurant. We don't draw these distinctions. A stakeholder is not going to draw the distinction and say, oh, this is probably an HR issue and HR just takes a little bit longer. This is a compliance issue, so I'm going to get the attention. It's just based on like what their actual sort of aggregate experience is at that particular restaurant. So the more integration we can have with with the department that should be our best friend, HR, and have that central risk brain that everybody's working out of, you really can get a lot of good knock-on effects from an employee experience perspective.
That's a great point.
Go ahead, Gio. I kind of cut you off. You just kind of sparked something there for me.
No, that's fine. We're vibing here. This is how we do it. This is the Ethicsverse, baby. So, as you look at this in the next couple pages, part of what you want to look at is take a look at these benchmarks and see, is there some proportion of your categories that you're not getting as many as somewhere else, and figure out what does that due to. That might be due to just a category definition issue. Maybe you have several things that you've compiled into just one generalized category, and you should start breaking those apart, maybe not just based on the number of issues you get, but how important they are, right? Maybe 3 reports of, suspected or assertion of retaliation are just as important as 20 issues about, the facilities, not being clean enough or something. you should have your categories represent where you want to focus and how you want to report on your issues. And these things that we're showing you, changes in proportion, the way these things break down, it should just be one hint for you to dig in and see, hey, you know what? I think I'm losing something the way I mash these categories together. I should split them out.
So here we double click on we double click on those issue categories. Again, these are kind of subcategories within the compliance function. So let's just jump down to some things to think about. So have you seen some notable shifts in your compliance concerns, in your HR concerns, in any of your aggregate categories? Can you explain those? Are there external factors going on? Have you just done an acquisition? Has there been a push on a particular topic within your organization that can serve as a falsifiable catalyst for the movement that you're seeing? And is there opportunity to really change your categories to make them work for you? So can you anticipate some changes like we've been talking about? There's an economic change. There's more fraud, waste, and abuse reports going on right now. What does that portend for the future? And what can we put in place to make sure that the train's not getting off the tracks? Can we put some of those tripwires or guardrails in place so that we don't get bit by the same snake over and over again? So I think adjusting your categories to meet your needs is a great place to start. I've been surprised at how categories as a function in an investigation process are used. Like, there's a very wide spectrum in philosophies on how people utilize categories. I've seen some people have like 80 different categories. I've seen others that have 10 to 12 major parent categories, and they have a much more much more detailed subcategories. You need to make your categories work for you. And I just think if we over-fractalize our categories, we start to lose, analytical potential. So we want to group, we want as few categories, at least at the parent level. We want as few categories as possible, but no fewer. We want to group things together in ways that can direct our efforts or direct reports to the people that are kind of specialized in those certain things. The second thing is to talk about periodic reviews of your categories. So the categories that you inherited, those might not be the right categories for your business now after you've done a couple of acquisitions, or just in terms of how you think about the business. So make those categories work for you, but also keep in mind the importance of making sure that the historical data is updated appropriately. You don't want to break that longitudinal analysis potential by having different multiple different sort of like category taxonomies in play within a particular data set. So the example I like is if you used to have discrimination and harassment as separate categories and you're combining those right now, make sure you go back and combine all those categories as well so that you can see what changes there are in those aggregate trends. So
yes, you want to have your categories, fit your organization, the risk that you see, the culture that you're trying to drive, and obviously your policies. And I just want to reinforce that one of the strongest ways that you can get value out of your categories is looking at time series data. It was really exciting about a year and a half ago on our eco reports. We rolled out a push button click compare to the last period. So you can, look at Q4 of last year compared to Q3, or Q4 of last year compared to Q4 of the year before. And those types of things are going to give you some of your best benchmarking against your own performance and see how those things have changed. And then from there, you can dig in, right? You can, drill in, if you're on our platform, you can drill in and say, okay, what are the reports coming up in this slice of the pie? Okay, what are the new types of categories, or what is driving this difference? Because, this is really more than you comparing yourself to the average company. It's you comparing yourself to where you were a year ago. And we want to be in a continuous improvement mentality and seeing those shifts period over period, right? 1 quarter to the next, or 1 quarter compared to a year before, are some of the most powerful ways that you can see, in ways that maybe, it's kind of hard to see the forest for the trees as you're just going through cases, but you can see kind of changes in trends in the overall health of your culture, and categories compared period over period is one of the best ways to do that.
All right, let's jump into issue severity. Gio, why don't you launch us into this one?
Yeah, this is an important distinction, because so much of what we deal with in compliance and ethics is related to risk, right? And risk curves have tails where most of the risk is. We all know that every report you get is not the average report. There are probably a bunch, like we see here, that 80 to 85% of your reports are not 4-alarm fires, don't need people to drop everything and go after them. You still want to follow up with those. You want to close those out in a timely manner. You want to get those off your team's plate so they can focus on these kind of top 2 severities, right? We call, severity 2 is something that is quite important, but not necessarily urgent. And severity 1 is kind of important and urgent, and someone should address it directly. And you want to look at this over time against your total number of reports, right? You can look at it like we show here, what percentage of your reports are severity 1, but you also want to see how that changes. If you're getting significantly more total reports, but you're getting the same number, you've gotten 10 severity 1 reports over the past 2 years, but last year you got 150 total reports, and this year you're getting 200 total reports, that percentage is going to go down, but maybe, you're getting a consistent count of those. And you want to look at this to understand where is the locus of risk in your organization. And you want to be able to dig in on this and understand, hey, for those severity 1s and 2s, you're probably spending more time on them. They're probably more complex issues. You're probably trying to do them faster. And also those are likely the ones where there's a higher risk of impact of the sentiment and the psychology within your organization. If you drop the ball on a severity 1 issue, not only is that risk to shareholders and to your board and, to the reputation of your organization, those are probably also the issues that, if you drop the ball on it, it doesn't get assigned properly, it's not followed up on quickly enough. That's probably also the area that is going to have the most dire impact on your culture of compliance and speak up.
So let's jump right down to issue severity. I think if you see anomalies in your issue severity metric, there's a couple of great questions to ask. So I think the first question is, are your definitions properly calibrated? Has something changed with respect to your definitions? When's the last time you looked at your directives, and what objective measures you are utilizing to determine if something is a high severity? Start there. Then think about what your intake process looks like, and are those channels properly equipped and properly educated on what those severity determinations are? If you're constantly getting reports from your hotline or reports from managers that are marked as a low severity, but then once an investigator gets into it and they say like, oh my gosh, this is a freaking fire, we got to get moving here, there's probably some education on those channels, whether it's directives with your hotline provider, or it's better, more frequent education with respect to those managers to make sure that those severities are dialed in appropriately. And then the last thing to look at is like, are your response protocols dialed into those severity determinations? So if a severity hits the hotline, has your call tree been updated? Do you have the information going to the right people, and are those loops getting closed appropriately? Again, things get stale, code and software gets stale, bread in the pantry gets stale. We have to constantly check these things and make sure that there's not mold growing on our investigation process. So we got to use these are all these metrics. These are all tools for us to drive our behavior internally, to drive our efforts and our focuses internally, to build the effective program that's going to withstand external scrutiny and actually move the bottom line of the organization, actually lay that foundation for the culture of integrity that leads to that business outperformance. All right, issue substantiation. So I love issue substantiation. I love how it's skyrocketing. We're almost at 60% substantiation, so that's phenomenal. A lot of that can come from better intake. So we'll talk about that some more here in a second, but let's just look at the numbers straight away. In 2024, issue substantiation rate jumped almost 5 points to 58%. That's compared to the status quo average of kind of between 41 and 45% over the last few years. So issue substantiation is a great metric. It can give you some indication as to like the broad success of your program, because it indicates that people know that they know what to report, and you're able to close the loop on those things. A couple of headwinds for issue substantiation, or let's just say a couple of things that I think make issue substantiation, while this is like an anchor point metric for a lot of programs, I want to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics at play that make this not as good as we might think. Just as a North Star substantiation rate, I'm saying. So there's always going to be some proportion of unsubstantiatable reports. If something happened in an elevator with one other person, that might be a hard thing to substantiate unless the perpetrator sort of admits to it, right? So there's also an education piece. Many times, particularly in anonymous reports, we just kind of get what we get. So when people don't provide the right information, again, particularly in the anonymous scenario where we can't follow back up with that person and get our additional questions answered, either our web form or the education of that stakeholder might need some work. There might be some opportunity for improvement there because it's hard to substantiate something if we don't have those base, those core facts that we can kind of investigate. And then I'd say the final bad thing, or we'll call it a bad thing. The final bad thing about substantiation rate is that it's just like a really slow metric. So this concept of fast and slow metrics, I think, is important for us to understand. Think about your dashboard on your car. Your speedometer is a fast metric. You push the gas down, that moves immediately. A slow metric is your gas gauge, like how much fuel, your fuel gauge. So we need to have a mix of slow and fast metrics that we're utilizing to drive our car in this example being our program. So issue substantiation, it's maybe a decent sort of macro, slow kind of a lagging indicator. But what we've seen, particularly over the last year, is more people augmenting the information value from substantiation with something that is a faster metric that they can control, and that is their rate of corrective action plans. So on the back end of, like we often say, the end of an investigation is not the end of something, it's the start of something. There's usually, okay, I've substantiated this, okay, here's an issue, we need to close the loop on it, we need to put out this fire. Your ability to have a high rate of corrective action plan completion across categories in a consistent way is one of the easiest ways to demonstrate effectiveness externally, and one of the best ways for you to get faster confirmation that your efforts are moving the right needles in the right direction. So again, we have to be high agency with our programs. We have to set a vision and we have to put the ball in the net, so to speak. We have to make that vision a reality. And what I found is that when we can have higher agency and we can start creating data pools ourselves that are faster metrics, it allows us to falsify our hypotheses a lot faster, and it allows us to prove effectiveness a lot faster, particularly just because you substantiate an issue, that doesn't mean that risk has been mitigated consistently. And when we're talking about a culture of integrity that drives actual effectiveness, we want to be able to show that loop is actually closed in a consistent way. So issue substantiation, great metric for sure, but think about ways that you can make this an even more powerful metric and create a circumstance where the metric that you're monitoring is an even better indicator for effectiveness of your program than something like issue substantiation, which in many cases has a lot of aspects that are outside of your control. All right, so let's talk about analyzing some of our substantiation trends, Gio.
Yeah. So one thing, we're going to keep trying to encourage you to compare different drivers to get insight into it. And this first one is about evaluating your substantiation by category. If you find that there are certain categories that have a relatively low substantiation rate on them, then you might try to think about how can the guidance you give to employees, the directives that are on your hotline or the information that's posted on your web form, and the way that you follow up on those investigations can increase substantiation by getting more information, defining categories properly, doing your handoffs properly, and things like that. As you break that down, right, all of your unsubstantiated reports are going to fall into one or more categories, and that can give you some hints on how you might be able to work that down by taking the category that has the highest incidence or highest count of unsubstantiated reports and seeing what you can do about that. We can't boil the ocean, but you can get a ladle out or get a bucket out and boil that one. So try to break this down into the area that you that has the most opportunity for improvement. So we can go on to the next slide, but cutting this by category is one great way to do that. You also want to do that through different intake channels and understanding your substantiation rate. If you have a relatively low substantiation rate on your web intake, for example, maybe you should have different questions on there. Maybe you need some different guidance, or maybe you need something that allows your team to follow up efficiently and effectively with that reporter to get that follow-up information. This is somewhat anecdotal, but as we've kind of followed, as we've understood users process and workflows through the system, a bunch of that substantiation rate or that substantiation happens based on the follow-up. So, it may be a case where anonymous reporters or web reporters are not engaging as directly with the investigation. So if you can't, send emails to an anonymous reporter, or you can't, post follow-up to your web form and easily guide and remind people to check back for that information, then you're maybe only substantiating things that come in with the right information up front, and you're missing that improvement in total substantiation that happens throughout your investigation.
So Gio kind of alluded to this before, but again, we want to get everybody comfortable with really trying to understand how the machine works. How does this engine that drives your program forward actually work? Well, we have to do some experiments, and we have to, kind of get in there and tinker around a little bit. So when we look at substantiation rate across a couple of these different things, they can tell some different stories. So this infographic shows substantiation rates across business sectors. It shows it case closure time, substantiation rate by case closure time distribution, and substantiation rate by different reporter types. So there's some interesting trends here. And again, this is going to be unique for your own business, particularly around like who you're opening it up to. Is it just an employee line? Are you letting patients or other sort of external stakeholders participate as well? And do you have a decentralized or a centralized system? Are you seeing different substantiation rates? Significantly different substantiation rates across these different cuts. We have to just spend some time noodling around in the kitchen, so to speak, doing some experimentation to start driving more ideas for improvement. So if you're thinking about substantiation, let's focus on quality investigations that lead to sound conclusions. And let's also focus on how we can create some faster metrics or some faster data pools by augmenting our process that not only give us a faster indication on whether the train's on the tracks or not, but also creates auditable proof for the effectiveness of our program. Remember, our goal is perfection. It's never going to be achieved. Our goal is the top of the mountain. We're never going to get there. It's all good. It's noble to continue to climb that mountain. It's noble to close the gap between your actual performance and the ideal performance that you're striving toward. And so that just takes a continuous improvement mode. And that takes a mindset to focus our efforts and activities on the things that are going to move the needle most, because we're never going to get to full perfection. Okay. We're getting toward the end here. I'd like to talk at least about one more of these. Look, the full benchmark report, like I said, has all this and more, a lot more tips, a lot more strategies, a lot more things to think about on how you can actually affect these things. The worst thing we can ever do, particularly right now, as we're at this kind of inflection point in our industry, is to say, well, our Speak Up program is just the Speak Up program. It just kind of does what it does. It's like, no, there's so much risk intelligence. People are thirsty for an organization that values their voice. There's so much more value that ethics and compliance can provide to the organization. There's so much more reframing that we have to do in the hearts and minds of the stakeholders up and down that leadership stack in our organization. And now, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of all the changes that are going on in our economy and in our businesses, now is the time. If we haven't started doing it, now is the time to start showing up a little bit differently and figuring out some ways to drive some real improvement that translates into more sustainable business outperformance. What do you want to jump to here? Let's jump to this, Gio. Let's jump to reporter awareness.
As you get the slides there, just to do a quick scan of what else is in here. We're cutting things by type of reporter: employee, vendor, contractor, anonymous, and we don't know. We're cutting things by issue sequence. So which ones have follow-ups? Where are the reports where an employee comes back and gives more information? And, you can cut that against some of these other metrics. I think you want to jump to issue sequence, Nick, and we can go through that one for follow-ups. And then, at the end, we look at this by company size, right? That's going to be a big driver of what your proper benchmark is. We see, a big difference between, a company that has 500 or 1,000 employees versus a Fortune 100 company. And you can look through that information as we get toward wrapping up time here and cover one more of these. But, these are all in there for you. And like Nick said, we're happy to engage with you, answer questions, try to help coach your team or compare this for you, because this should help you map out your journey. This is not about getting to a destination and being the perfect compliance program. We want to keep, trying to hit that summit, but these metrics should give you some hints on what you can compare to and how you can run your internal comparisons so that you can figure out your journey, how to get higher on that elevation. So let's go to issue sequence, Nick.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, issue sequence. So this graph shows us the percentage of reports that needed or that had a follow-up. So 16%, it's been pretty stable over the last few years. It's ticked up a bit back to COVID levels, but still significantly lower, almost half as high as the status quo, which has come down in its own right over the last few years. So look, there's always going to be follow-ups. We just want to make those follow-ups as valuable as possible. Whether it's anonymous or it's identified, we want to make sure that we're following up with them and keeping them apprised of what's going on in the investigation and what progress is being made and so forth. You must be, I'll say it. I think it's super critical to be utilizing whatever two-way communication you have available with anonymous reporters, because again, when they're anonymous or identified, it's still a person and it's still somebody whose engagement you want to maximize in the context of the mission of your organization. So minimizing follow-ups to the extent possible is great. That can come from education. That can come from a hotline intake that is equipped with, FAQs and the means by which to answer, questions that a caller might have. All those things can help, reduce that follow-up rate.
Yeah. So, just like anonymity, you don't want no follow-ups, but also too many follow-ups indicate that your team is spending unnecessary time. You're not getting the information up front. You're not able to take as fast of follow-up and closure because you don't have the right information up front. So, that's another one of those that you don't want to drive to zero. You want some balance in it. But if it's too high, it might indicate a challenge with your culture or your process.
So we are right at time. I hope that this was valuable for you. I hope you enjoyed this session and got a couple of nuggets either from us or from the chat that you can start looking at your program a little bit differently. We want to just end on this missing link. Making the most of middle managers is really going to be the key to our success. So 5 years from now, when we're clinking glasses at the top of the mountain, and we're, celebrating all the wins, it's because we've been able to successfully and sustainably activate these middle managers, these true culture carriers that have such a disproportionate impact on our organization. They have access to so much risk intelligence that we need to help our organization and to show our worth in the company. And we just have to do things a little bit differently. So check out this middle manager toolkit. We have another toolkit coming out in about a month that's going to have a bunch of great resources on how to, and a great playbook on how to, relaunch your Speak Up program and start driving toward, those higher order of magnitude levels of risk intelligence that exist. So please reach out if we can be helpful. If you have questions about this, please email us directly. We're happy to answer them all. And like Gio said, happy to talk through this, help your team or whatever. This is the decade. This is the decade where it all changes for us. And I've never been more excited about all the opportunity in this space. So let's go out there and get them. And we'll see you next week. We've got a great session next week. We're going to be talking about single program, multiple jurisdictions. We got the one and only Matt Kelly coming, a couple of other great guests. So stay tuned for that. And we'll see you next time. Take care.